Okay, we're going to get started here, well, we'll talk about what we're going to do here in a second. So, okay, let's have a word of prayer before we begin. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this night where we can read and meditate upon your word. Help us to gain wisdom from some of the things that we look at in your law that you gave through Moses to teach and guide your people. Help us to understand these things that we might learn from them and be able to walk in your ways better. And so we thank you for this opportunity that we're able to come together tonight. And we ask you to please give us wisdom, give us understanding, and watch over us, take care of us, as you have so much in the past. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so typically when I go through the law topically, which basically starts, really the law begins to be given. In fact, there's a covenant section, which I didn't really prep for, but Exodus like 17 to 21 is really this covenant section where God actually establishes a covenant with the people of Israel that come out of Egypt. He basically does it again and reiterates it to their children in Deuteronomy 40 years later. Right before they enter, he actually renews the covenant with the children, basically, that grew up in the wilderness. And the outline that I have is actually it's created by Eflegard Smith. And if you have the chronological Bible or the daily Bible, that you can read there the law in topical order. So there's a couple more, Janae, coming in to give them that. And so that's where the outline comes from. And so it basically breaks down all of the law, all of the commandments into topically. And because you have on a single topic, you'll have some addressed in Exodus, some in Leviticus, some in Deuteronomy, occasionally in Numbers. And so you have the same topic is not just addressed once, it's addressed multiple times in the writings from Exodus through Deuteronomy. And so that's why, you kind of in order to really get the whole thing on any topic, you have to really read all the passages about it to understand all the different parts about it. So you'll see on page what says lesson 16, I drew a line around it, and that's for today. So I went through the whole law, and I chose ones, since I only want to take the rest of this month, which is 4 classes. I decided, well, I just will hit these things. We may not be able to hit all of it as well, but on this page, we're just going to hit these 2 things, the idea of dedications and tithings. And then on the next page, lesson 17 was the feasts. So there are 7 feasts in total, or holy days. They're not all feasts, but we may look at all of those. And then the next section on page 22, it's lesson 18, is all of the sacrifices and offerings, okay? And so we may look at those and just kind of understand the difference between the burnt offerings, the cereal offerings, the peace offerings, the sin offerings, the guilt offerings, the special offerings. And then... actually, we may stop there. We might get to the last one, lesson 25. I do like just the idea of even looking at how you're supposed to treat animals, and then kind of the requirements for benevolence, what God expected of them in terms of helping others. So anyway, so we'll kind of... we'll get through as much of this stuff as we can, but I thought these are pretty good in terms of having good application for us, principles to understand. So Okay. Well, let's read. I'm going to read these passages, and then we'll discuss them. So the questions I have under them, I may or may not ask, but we'll go ahead and read them all first. Okay. So in Exodus 22, we get introduced here in 29 and 30, the idea of dedicating certain or people and animals. So we're going to read all these different parts in Exodus and Deuteronomy, and then we'll kind of discuss them all together. So 29:30 says, "You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep." Oh, bummer. Come on. My thumb hit something and changed. So you shall do the same with your oxen, with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. So this idea of basically giving or just that by itself, what would you think it means to give your firstborn and to give, your firstborn animals to God?
Well, it kind of seems like the way that grammatical logic works, that you're either talking about consecrating, them to the Lord, or you're sacrificing them. Both. It's either the firstborn animal, the firstborn child, is either being sacrificed, or just simply being consecrated to God.
What do you mean by consecrated?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me. I gave you the word that I thought best fit, but I'm not. It is dedicated to God.
Well, it actually is used in verse 31. So
Yeah. Oh, good.
I think it's one of those words that I think it's a very religious word that I'm not sure people always understand. So that's why I asked you what you think it means.
Well, I think about the Nazirite vow.
Mm-hmm.
I think about the vows that historically people have taken to God, and the way that the firstborn has to be purchased back. But that consecrated to me means dedicated to, and whether that's in every single thing, in the way that they act, in the way that how do I further define that? I know there are better biblical words for this, and I'm not using them right now.
Well, it basically means to set things apart and make them sacred, make them holy. It's the idea of holiness is to set something apart for God. So to consecrate it means to make it special. It's not just one of something, it's a special one. So let's say you have, you probably didn't go through any kind of ceremony to consecrate things in your home, but I would guess everybody has consecrated things in their home. If you received china when you were first married, you probably have that set someplace different from your regular plates, right? In essence, you consecrated it by setting it apart in it because it's special to you, okay? So it's consecrated to you because it's special to you. And so you have it set aside separate. And so some of it might be, you might have some things that are special that you wouldn't put them in the dishwasher, right? Because the dishwasher doesn't always treat finishes on plates or certain things well, and so it'll damage some plates or bowls or anything you have that might be special, and it could be They could be glass things that have, printing on them. It could be, ceramic things, and it dulls and ruins the finish. The dishwasher does. So I don't do, but most of you have things you wouldn't put in the dishwasher. Why?
Ruins it, dulls and ruins.
Why do you care if it's ruined or not? They only last so long, right?
If you take care of it, it lasts longer.
Okay, you want it to last long. So it's just because you want it to last longer. Yeah, and usually you want it to last longer because it's special. And so, just understanding that's the idea of something that's consecrated to God, is that it becomes special, okay? And it's not common, okay? So yeah, it was a fine word to use, but I put you on the spot just to help people understand what it meant.
You know what's funny is I always had the definition of the word consecrated in my head as set aside for a special purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And yet.
You couldn't get it out.
For some reason, could not get that to come back.
It's like
So-
sanctification also.
It is, yes, it is.
And in King James and New King James, it says holy.
Mhm. Yeah, they're all related. Okay, and then, so it's the same topic essentially comes up in chapter 23 and verse 19. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. And then in chapter 34, 19 and 20. It says, all that open the womb are mine. All your male livestock, the firstborn of your cow and sheep, the firstborn of a donkey, you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. All the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. Didn't say with your firstborn that you could, if you didn't want to redeem it, break its neck. But you notice he actually says here, they're all his, except he mentions that the donkey, you've got to buy it back with a lamb. I don't want the donkeys. God didn't want the donkeys for whatever reason. So it kind of reminds me of the sheep and the goats thing. The goat's not going to be his, the sheep will be his. Because donkeys kind of have that same goat personality to them, or oftentimes. So we kind of look at all those different passages, and so you see that this content, and it kind of fits in with what we're going to talk about with tithing here in a minute. But you notice that what did God say about all the animals and about all the people and about all of the, so when we talk about animals and people, you're talking about firstborn, okay? Now, there are also places where the firstborn become, we're going to look at Deuteronomy here in a second. The firstborn also become kind of firstborn males. Here it doesn't mention that, it just mentions all the firstborn. Actually it does say all your male livestock here in verse 19. So there are places where sometimes, that's why you have to kind of read all the different passages, because sometimes there will be places where another kind of condition is put in some place and you don't see it in another. And so it applies to all the animals and people, but then he also applied it essentially to all of their crops. Now with crops, it's not firstborn. What is it with crops? First fruits. And so what did he teach about that? We're going to go to Deuteronomy here in a second, but what is he teaching us about the firstborn and the first fruits being his? What is the lesson for us?
He comes first.
He comes first, okay. Are you confident in your answer, or are you guessing?
No, that's what I've pulled from that, is that's the importance of him and all the things that we're able to do is,
Mm-hmm.
above all else. And so if we're gonna reap from the rewards that he's about us to sow,
Okay.
it's then the first part of that, and it goes to him.
Okay. So he comes, okay. So, yeah. Yeah.
I guess also it's better to give than to receive. So we're giving, if you're giving of your first fruits rather than just receiving it.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe it's like we're.
I'm gonna push back on you guys a little bit here in a second. Go ahead.
I was just thinking along with what Forrest says, that in giving God the first things, you're thinking of him first,
Okay.
in a way. So you're
Yeah.
putting him first by doing that.
Okay.
And maybe that's how you are thanking him for his blessings. And maybe it has something to do with Christ being his firstborn.
Sure. The firstborn, yeah. The firstborn and first fruits certainly have a lot to do with Christ. And even his church are called the church of the firstborn. Those who are his are firstborn, essentially. And this is going to point to the thing, because you kind of mentioned too. Does somebody else have something? Did somebody else kind of raise their hand about this? So we got one other passage I'm going to read here in a second. But here's the thing that I'll disagree slightly on all that you said. And that is you kept saying give. You can't give to somebody something that is theirs. You can only steal from them if it's theirs. Does that make sense? Because that's what he told us. It's not like it's yours to give them. It is God's. That's what he's telling us. He goes, this is mine. You don't give it to him. You're not just not thinking of him. You're stealing it from him. Which, by the way, is the attitude Abraham talked about when he gave a tithe of all, when he saved Lot, and he basically took all of the king's stuff. And when he came came to Melchizedek, he gave a tithe of it all. And he says, I would never rob or steal from God. He was committed to that because he understood that concept. It's not mine to keep. I think it's a subtle difference between me thinking I'm going to give the first portion of mine to saying that I am going to give him what is his. I don't know. It's subtle, but I think it's an important mental note. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah, we're talking about the intention, not just the mental note, it's the intention behind what's going on, right? The intention is, it's not, as you mentioned, mine to give. This is
Right.
not something that I possess.
Yes.
This is,
Right.
because Ben does a great class about the authority of God. And I'm not sure where that came from, but everything underneath him is given by him,
Mm-hmm.
in subsequent layers
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So we all have to refer back up, we have this.
Right.
But the authority of God reigns above that. We've got to
Right.
go back to that.
And that's why, like even with the donkey, he doesn't want donkeys, right? But the donkey's still his. So what did he make you do if you're back then?
Go ahead.
You had to buy it back. He didn't even give you a choice. You had to buy it back. So, and I do make the point, I think I made it in the back classroom recently, but the one exception of a firstborn male in Scripture that we know was not redeemed, and I think some people back there got it right in my class in the back, remembered it. Do you know the person that is recorded in Scripture as not being redeemed? Samuel, yes. And the reason, if you might remember the reason Samuel's not redeemed by his mother prayed, because when she prayed and asked, because she was, not having children, when she prayed to have children, she said, I will give him to you. And so the reason she basically didn't redeem him, she didn't go and take him and redeem him, because he was God's. And as soon as he was weaned, she went and brought him to the temple. And that's why he was raised in the temple. from a priest family, and then obviously becomes the last judge of Israel before the prophet and a judge, and ultimately a priest who ushers in the kings, and helps Saul, and also appoints David to become king after Saul. But and so that you get the idea. She didn't redeem him because she was giving him to God. So. Okay. Let's read this passage here in Deuteronomy 15, 19 through 23. Talks about the same kind of thing here again. And this is written now for that other, next generation after the one that came out of Egypt. He says, all the firstborn males that are born of your herd and your flock you shall dedicate to the Lord your God. You shall do no work with the firstborn of your herd, nor shear the firstborn of your flock. You shall eat it, you and your household, before the Lord your God, year by year, at the place that the Lord will choose. But if it has any blemish, if it is lame or blind or has any serious blemish, whatever, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. You shall eat it within your towns. The unclean and the clean alike may eat it, as though it were a gazelle or a deer. Only you shall not eat its blood. You shall pour it out on the ground like water. And so here, notice that these, and I think Mark had mentioned it earlier, that this idea of dedicating them or consecrating them sometimes means that they die, that they're sacrificed and killed. So these particular firstborns are not going to be, you're never going to work them. You're never going to, you're not going to become milk cows, or, they're going to become, an offering. Obviously, male cow wouldn't be a milk cow, but but you're not going to make them a working part of the herd. They're going to be special. They're going to be set aside, and then they will be your food. Especially the holy ones will be the food in the feasts. Because they have a lot of feasts. One of the things we're going to look at in some coming weeks is all the feasts that they had. And in those feasts, they're required to eat, oftentimes special foods and things at them. So that's what a lot of them were dedicated for. So God's telling them in these other places we had seen, okay, the first were going to be set aside for him. What does that mean? Are they bringing them to the priests? Or no, we see that they're not bringing them to the priests, the animals anyway. They're keeping them, and they're going to use them for their feasts and things. So we get a little bit more information in the Deuteronomy than we had in the previous ones. Any other thoughts or questions just on that idea of the firstborn and the dedicated things? Yeah. They would, yeah. Actually, they had these calves ready, right? So now, kind of, if we read this, we understand. Okay, they've got animals ready for those feasts, don't they? You can see Abraham kind of, when the angels appeared to him, he didn't really realize they were angels initially, but he prepares and gets a calf, right, and prepares food. Well, he's not just taking one out. Oh, go get one. He's taking one that's not working most likely, and he's preparing it. I don't know for sure Abraham is following these rules, but a lot of these things that we see in the law predated Moses writing them down. They were being practiced already by Abraham and his sons and their families before Moses actually wrote a lot of this down. But yeah, so you can see that when in the prodigal son, the father prepares the fatted calf. Yeah, it's the calf that's kind of the veal. We've got the one prepared for veal. Yeah, that sounds a lot nicer too. Than it's like, wow, that's a better meal than the cow that's out there working so hard. No, we're keeping that one. Then it work. It doesn't work. It's nice and soft and tender, and it's like, oh yeah, it tastes extra special. No. Okay. Any other thoughts or things on dedicated? Yeah.
If you have a family
I think for a lot of these rules, yeah, because he mentioned, a number of these places talk the firstborn male. Yeah, the firstborn male was the one that had to be redeemed, had to be done, which is an important thing when you come to, and I make this point sometimes in the New Testament, in the passage where it talks about we are all sons of God. And the reason, one of the reasons you need to understand the Old Testament is to understand that concept. And I don't know if a lot of women get bothered by the fact that you're a son of God, but the reason that it says it like that is because of the shadow that the law created. You're exactly like all the males, that were all sons of God, all inheritors, right? Because the girls generally didn't inherit. There was an exception to that when they had no sons, but and that had to be addressed. It wasn't even addressed directly in the law. It actually was addressed by a family that had no sons, and they went to Moses and go, well, what do we do? Well, they only have girls. And he went, okay, well, here's what you do in that case. But, so this is the law here is used as a foreshadowing of what God is doing with all of us. And the New Testament uses a lot of the imagery to help us understand that that's why all of us, male and female alike, all become sons of God, inheritors and things. So, yeah. Okay. Let's see. Any other thoughts or questions on that one?
I have just one thing that
Yep.
made me think of it when you were talking about like items in our houses that we consider,
Mm-hmm.
consecrated or special or,
Right.
whatever. When I was in China, I was with a lot of Catholics, and I was often assumed to be Catholic just because I was with all the Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
And we traveled to a city, and we went to like a Catholic church, and really strangely, we knew someone that this Catholic priest knew. And so he was all excited about that, and he gave us like these little statue things, and he consecrated them, blessed us, and gave us these little statues.
Mm-hmm.
I'm completely clueless, and I like put it in my backpack. And that's when we traveled with our backpacks. That's all we had. So I stuck it
Right.
in there, and then like we went to dinner, and my backpack fell over and like went cheek. And my friend who's Catholic goes, "Did you just break that?" And I was like,
Apparently it broke.
And she's like, "We have to bury that or burn it because it's consecrated." And I was like, "Oh." And so it sat like on my
It's like,
shelf in my room in China for like the next 6 months.
Until
And
you
before
could
we
dispose
left,
properly.
She was like panicking about what we had to do with this consecrated thing that I'd broken. And so she went out and buried it like in
Yeah.
the like little dirt area.
That's right. See, that's what you get to learn when you go to catechism. You get to learn what you're supposed to do in all these cases.
Yeah.
You get to learn all the rules. Yeah. Yeah. Not, that's a good example of, how people, they understand the concept, I do think that we've kind of missed I guess in a certain way, we've done that with this building, right? This is a building that, all of the congregation here, years ago, built. And its use is for God, isn't it? And so it's not even though it's essentially a common structure, its use and purpose is one for God. And that's essentially what it means to kind of do that. But, so in a lot of different religions have kind of their different ceremonial things like that. Yeah, that's why sometimes you have to kind of be in them to understand all the rules around them. Yeah. Oh, I'm sure didn't the others put them in their backpack too? They probably wrapped it more protectively though. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts on it? Because we're going to go into tithing, and tithing is really about the first fruits. to some degree. It's not all about first fruits, as we're going to show you. But, and then, so we're two passages we want to look at. So we're going to read Deuteronomy 14 here and then Deuteronomy 18. It says, "You shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year. And before the Lord your God, in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. And if the way is too long for you, so that you are not able to carry the tithe, when the Lord your God blesses you, because the place is too far from you, which the Lord your God chooses to set his name there, then you shall turn it into money and bind up the money in your hand. Go to the place that the Lord your God chooses and spend the money for whatever you desire, oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, whatever your appetite craves. And you shall eat there before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. You shall not neglect the Levite who's within your towns, for he has no portion or inheritance with you. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your town shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do." So first off, one of the huge problems, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about tithe a little bit is because the vast majority of Christians I've ever known, regardless of the church they have, whatever Christian variety they have come from, the number that actually understand tithing in the Old Testament is incredibly small. And so, hopefully, some of you have been here a while. I've taught them on these things for a bit. But it's one of those things that we kind of think we know what it means, but we don't often know all of it. And so in this particular case, so in this passage, what is this? What are they doing with this tithe? There's two tithes mentioned here, by the way. I don't know if you really caught that. But what's the first one that's mentioned? What are they doing with it? Well, yeah, that's the second one he mentions. They're storing it up in their towns and get for all of the people, fatherless, widows, people in need. It could even be a traveler, somebody, a foreigner. They don't have to be a Jew to be given from the part that they store up. That is every third year. So every third year they take a tithe and they store it. Now I said a tithe because when we think of tithing, most of the time we think of the first fruits, right? But in fact, there are 10 tithes. If you tithe all of your stuff, that means dividing it into portions of tenths, because tithe means a tenth. And what he's telling them is to tenth everything, and then use a tenth. So in this particular passage, he talked about two different tenths they were using. So the first one is you're going to eat it in a feast. So you're going to take a tithe, you and your family, and you're in your house, and you're going to have this rejoicing feast. And if you have to travel too far to the place for the feast, then you can sell it all, and then you can go there and buy it. By the way, that's why there were money changers and there were tables in the temple that had animals and different things like that, because they were selling those things to people who were coming from long distances and needed to buy all of that stuff. Okay, so they were practicing exactly what's said here. Only thing they were doing wrong, really, the money changers, is they were charging exorbitant fees and things. The money changers in the temple, there's a couple things they were doing. They had turned a money changer thing into, you couldn't use your regular money to buy stuff at the temple, so you had to go and exchange it for temple money, but the exchange rate would really favored all the money changers. Okay, so and so it became kind of this weird little way for the money changers to rip people off. Okay, and charge them interest essentially to buy all the stuff they needed for their feasts. So that doesn't sound like the tithing we're used to, right? A lot of times when we think of the tithing, we think about giving. We think about giving money or giving your stuff. to God, to the priests and those things. But neither one of these tithes mentioned are that. So let's look at this next passage in chapter 18. Because he comes up again and in 18, 1 through 8. So we see the Levitical priests, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no portion or inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the Lord's offerings as their inheritance. So one of the things, we're going to look at some of the offerings later, and a lot of those offerings were not completely burned up. There are some of the offerings that are completely burned, but a lot of them weren't. Probably the majority of them were not completely burned. They would be portions burned, and the rest would go to the priests. The priests ate of that food, whether animals and or grains and other things. And he says, they shall have no inheritance among their brothers. The Lord is their inheritance, as he promised them. And this shall be the priest's due from the people, from those offering a sacrifice, whether an ox or a sheep. They shall give to the priest the shoulder and the 2 cheeks and the stomach, the first fruits of your grain. So first off, he talks about some animals here and the portions that became the priest's portion of the animal. And then he says, the first fruits of your grain, of your wine and your oil, and the first fleece of your sheep you shall give him. For the Lord your God has chosen him out of all your tribes to stand and minister in the name of the Lord, him and his sons for all time. And if a Levite comes from any of your towns and out of all of Israel where he lives, and he may come when he desires, to the place the Lord will choose, and ministers in the name of the Lord his God, like all his fellow Levites who stand and minister there before the Lord, then he may have equal portions to eat besides what he receives from the sale of his patrimony. And so one of the things that we learn is that the first fruits became theirs. Right? Now, and so we see, so this one is again a different one, isn't it? This is a different tithe than those other two that were mentioned. Because if you're eating the tithe yourself, how are you giving a tithe? To the priest, or giving your first fruit to the priest. You understand how, by definition, they can't all be the same. And if you're storing it up every 3 years, that can't be the portion you're eating, right? Now, there are a couple of debates in Judaism. Some see 3 tithes, and I agree with that. I think there are 3 tithes. But some see 2. Some see that the 3rd year you wouldn't eat it. And so some Jews, one of the debates in Judaism was, you always gave the tithe to the priests, or the first fruit tithe to the priests, but the other tithe that you ate, you'd eat 2 years, and the 3rd year you would give. So that's kind of the debate in Judaism, at least that I'm aware of. And that's why, so sometimes when we think of tithing, we just think of that first portion. But and we think of that first portion as something that I'm always giving. But in fact, other than that first fruits that you are giving, the other tithe was actually for yourself and for you to rejoice. And then the other tithe, which you did every 3 years, you were setting aside for the poor in your town. And it would be shared with whoever was in need, whoever had need at any one time. And whether they were a priest, or because, a priest could end up in need just as much as somebody else, so it really can't, and even a traveler, somebody traveling through, they would help them out as well. And so I actually, and people who have kind of, who I've taught in terms of kind of money principles, I talk about the 3 tithes this way, and I apply them in my own life this way. And so I give the first portion to God, the first 10th, and then I take a 10th and I kind of set it aside for my family, for just rejoicing, just use on feasts and or vacations or things that we rejoice, with. And then I use 3%. It's kind of, about rounding a little bit of 10th every third year. So I use about 3%. I try to set aside, that's just always set aside to give to people. And so, and I know a handful of other people have kind of followed through, and a number of people kind of do some of that as well. So I've used those principles in my own kind of financial dealings for the last, 25 or so years. Well, I guess that's about all I had to say on it. But what do you thoughts you guys have on understanding the tithe, or the different tithes as they would use? Questions or comments? Or yeah.
This idea of the tithing where it's like you share it every 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that might have influenced the early church and some of their love feasts, they call them, and things like that? Or is that totally different?
I do think it influenced the early church, because especially since the early church was so Jewish. The love feasts that are described is harder for me, because I'm not really sure what that phrase means in the early church. It's mentioned in history, but it's not mentioned so clearly that we know exactly what it refers to. So that's the challenge,
The only reference that I recall is
Yeah.
really Jude.
Yeah, he does kind of mention it.
It's almost more in passing.
Yes,
But
he does.
When you started talking about these feasts, I
Yeah.
was trying to think
Yeah.
of some sort of a New Testament.
Well, the ones that they set aside in the town, I don't know that they were using for feasts as much as they were using for needy. Because he mentions fatherless, widow, sojourner. He mentions most people who are talking about needy. And it seems to me it's kind of the early concept of, I don't know, we might in our present, way talk about welfare. Every town would have its own set money set aside, or grain. It wouldn't always be money. A lot of times it would be actually grain stores and things, and they would give them food, and they'd give at people who need. And so I think it was really more their way of caring for the needy, because it wasn't just this. It was also, like they couldn't glean their plants thoroughly. They had to leave bits on them. They also couldn't do the corners of their property. They had to leave those for people to go out and go. So you could go after somebody has gone through and gleaned from their field and left some of it in it, and they also were not able. They could not pick up what fell on the ground, so that those who were poor and needy amongst them could go in after them and pick up what was on the ground, pick up what was left on the plants, and glean into the corners of the properties. By the way, that's exactly what Ruth is doing in the story of Ruth. She is going after the gleaners to pick up food and grain for her and Naomi. And that's how Israel kind of took care of the poor and needy amongst them. So that particular one, I think, was that. And the early church was very benevolent and very giving and setting things aside for people, and they did that in abundance. We see right away, and especially when it was primarily Jewish. So I think the kinds of things they were used to doing for Judaism, I think a lot of the Jewish Christians began to essentially do in the early church as well.
And I think too, what we see in a lot of these commandments is we'll see references to widows and orphans.
Yes.
Widows and orphans,
Yeah. Right.
When you get down to where God starts judging
Right.
nations,
Right.
he starts with Israel.
Right.
Or starts with his own people. And
Yeah.
a lot of it is because they aren't showing that charity to widows and orphans
Right.
and those who need and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think, in the Old Testament, I remember reading a guy's book one time, and he was talking about how it's like, You know, and a lot of the churches, you know, won't take up a collection or won't take money from the collection to give to somebody who's, you know, not a member or not a Christian but you notice in this particular situation, they didn't differentiate needy persons from whether they had to be Jews. And I think it's one of the byproducts in the Christian era where the churches began to kind of control all the money. It kind of felt like all the money was the Lord's money, and so you wouldn't give it to those who weren't Christians. But the problem with the concept is not having. They wouldn't have given the tithe to the priest to others, right? The tithe to the priest was theirs. God is the one who gave it to them. But, in fact, he mentions that in some other passages about the priesthood. But since they had a separate store for the needy that was different from what they took up collection-wise to give to the priests, they never felt like they were giving the priest stuff to the needy. They were never giving God's portion to the needy, right? They were separate things. And I think one of the mistakes that's happened, now I think there's a reason for that, because the leaders of churches, by having everything within the church, the leaders in those churches got to control it all. And as opposed to having individuals kind of, you know, separate from because this storing it up, the people who most likely would have taken charge in the towns, because not every town had priests in it. So who's the people most likely charged with taking care of the money in the towns that's set aside for the poor? Who would have been their natural leaders? The rich? Well, probably a lot of them were, but I think we would think of the elders. When we think of the town elders, right? The people that sit in the gates, that reference. Because that's an ancient reference. Yeah, those who sit in the gates. Job was one of those, wasn't he? That concept was, so this idea that the elders of the town would have been the ones probably most likely responsible for the ones who would manage that. So it wasn't even a priest's job to manage this portion for the poor. So anyway, we'll leave it there, and we'll pick it up on the next page there.